Some courts aren't built for justice, they're built for slaughter. When city electrician Darius Wilson reported dangerous code violations in a powerful developer's buildings, he became a threat to be eliminated. A dead air. A fabricated murder. Charge. A judge whose gavel falls like an executioner's axe. I didn't kill anyone, Darius insists from the defendant's table. Judge Calloway smiles. He's heard it all before, from dozens of innocent men now serving his sentences in prisons that pay him for each body delivered. But buried evidence finds ways to surface. And this time, the system that was designed to crush one innocent man will collapse around those who built it. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The pounding on the door came just after 6 a.m. Darius Wilson was in the middle of making breakfast, a simple routine he'd followed for years before heading to his job as a city electrician. The sound was urgent, aggressive, nothing like the friendly knock of a neighbor. "Dad?" Zora called from upstairs, her voice tinged with concern. At 17, she was perceptive enough to know that unexpected visitors at dawn rarely brought good news. "Stay upstairs, Zora," Darius called back, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel. He moved to the front door cautiously, peering through the peephole. 4 police officers stood on his porch, hands hovering near their weapons. When he opened the door, chaos erupted. The lead officer shoved the door fully open, knocking Darius back. "Darius Wilson, get down on the ground now, hands where we can see them." "What's this about?" Darius asked, raising his hands slowly. But the officers weren't interested in explanations. 2 of them forced him face down onto the floor of his own home, roughly yanking his arms behind his back. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into his wrists. "Dad, what's happening?" Zora appeared at the foot of the stairs, her eyes wide with fear. She was still in her pajamas, hair wrapped in a scarf for the night. "It's okay, baby. Just stay back," Darius called, trying to keep his voice steady despite the knee pressing into his back. "Call your Aunt Tanya. Tell her what's happening." One of the officers moved toward Zora. "Get back upstairs, miss." "That's my daughter," Darius said, straining against the pressure on his back. "She has a right to know what's going on." "What am I being charged with?" The officers exchanged glances. The one who seemed to be in charge finally spoke. "You're being arrested for the murder of Brandon Keller." The words hit Darius like a physical blow. Brandon Keller, the real estate developer? The man had been in the news recently, something about a major development project. But Darius had only met him a handful of times while doing electrical work on his properties. "There must be some mistake," Darius said, his mind racing. "I didn't kill anyone. They all say that," muttered one of the officers, yanking Darius to his feet. Zora was crying now. "Dad, call Tanya, baby, I'll be okay. This is just a mistake," Darius called as they dragged him toward the door. The last thing he saw before they pushed him outside was his daughter's terrified face, tears streaming down her cheeks. The ride to the police station passed in a blur. Darius sat silently in the back of the patrol car, trying to make sense of what was happening. Brandon Keller was dead, and somehow they thought he was responsible. At the station, they led him to an interrogation room that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as 2 detectives entered the room. One black, one white, both wearing expressions that suggested they'd already decided his guilt. "Mr. Wilson," the white detective began, "I'm Detective Simmons. This is Detective Powell. You understand why you're here?" "No, I don't," Darius said firmly. "I didn't kill Brandon Keller. I barely knew the man." Detective Powell snorted. "Barely knew him? You've worked on multiple properties he owned. Electrical work, right? And now he's dead from electrocution in one of those very buildings." This new information hit Darius hard. "Electrocution? You think I—" He stopped, trying to gather his thoughts. "When did this happen?" "Yesterday evening, between 5:30 and 6:30 p.m., Simmons said, watching Darius closely. Relief flooded through him. "Then I couldn't have done it. I was at Mel's Diner on Wilson Street from about 5:15 until after 7. Mel knows me. I'm there every Thursday. There must be security footage, other customers who saw me. The detectives exchanged glances that, Darius couldn't read. We'll check that out, Powell said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe a word. In the meantime, we've got work orders showing you were the last person to service the electrical panel that killed Keller, and witnesses saw someone matching your description leaving the building around the time of death. That wasn't me, Darius insisted. And if you checked those work orders carefully, you'd see I flagged safety concerns in that building months ago. Mr. Keller ignored them. Convenient story, Simmons said. Sounds like you just gave us motive. The questioning continued for hours. No matter what Darius said, the detectives twisted his words or dismissed his explanations. By the time they left him alone, he was exhausted and increasingly worried. This wasn't just a mistake, it felt targeted. A public defender arrived later, that afternoon. A thin, harried-looking white man who introduced himself as Raymond Walsh. He barely made eye contact as he dropped a stack of files on the table between them. "Mr. Wilson, I've been assigned to your case," Walsh said, glancing at his watch. "I have about 15 minutes today, so let's make this quick." 15 minutes? Darius echoed in disbelief. "I'm being charged with murder." Walsh sighed. "One of 12 cases I'm handling this week. Look, the evidence against you is substantial. They have you at the scene." "I wasn't at the scene," Darius interrupted. "I was at Mel's diner. There are witnesses, maybe camera footage." Walsh waved a dismissive hand. "Alibi witnesses from friends or establishments you frequent are notoriously unreliable in court. Juries see them as biased. But it's the truth. Truth isn't always as important as you might think in our justice system," Walsh said, flipping through papers without really reading them. "What matters is what the prosecution can prove, and they have physical evidence connecting you to the scene. Motive in the form of reported safety concerns that could have cost you your job and opportunity." "But I didn't do it," Darius insisted. Walsh finally looked at him directly. "My job isn't to determine your guilt or innocence, Mr. Wilson. It's to ensure you receive due process. Your arraignment is tomorrow morning. Judge Henry Calloway's court." Something in the way Walsh said the judge's name made Darius uneasy. "What can you tell me about him?" Walsh's expression turned guarded. "Judge Calloway is efficient. His courtroom runs on time. He doesn't tolerate disruptions." He checked his watch again. "I need to go. We'll talk more after the arraignment." After Walsh left, Darius spent the night in a holding cell, unable to sleep as his mind raced with worry. About Zora, about the case being built against him, about this Judge Calloway. The next morning, dressed in the same clothes he'd been arrested in, Darius was led into the courtroom. Immediately he noticed the divide. On one side sat a group of well-dressed white people who had to be Keller's family. The dead man's father, Richard Keller, was recognizable from news coverage about his real estate empire. On the other side sat Zora and his sister Tanya, looking small and alone. "Zora," he called softly. A bailiff immediately stepped forward. "No talking to the gallery." Before Darius could respond, a door opened, and Judge Henry Calloway swept in. He was a tall, heavy-set, white man in his 60s with cold blue eyes that surveyed the courtroom as everyone rose. "Be seated," he said, his voice carrying authority. As he settled into his chair, Darius noticed something troubling. The way Calloway nodded almost imperceptibly to Richard Keller, the slight smile when his gaze passed over the prosecution. Table and the flat, disinterested expression when he looked at the defense. The arraignment proceeded quickly. The charges were read, and when asked how he pled, Darius spoke clearly. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Calloway's eyes narrowed slightly. "Bail?" The prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman with auburn hair, rose. "Your Honor, given the severity of the crime, the state requests that the defendant be held without bail. Mr. Wilson is accused of first-degree murder with premeditation." Walsh half-heartedly argued for reasonable bail, citing Darius's clean record and community ties, but his arguments lacked conviction. Calloway barely seemed to listen before denying bail. "Defendant will be remanded to custody until trial," he declared, banging his gavel. As Darius was led away, he caught a glimpse of Zora's devastated face. He tried to give her a reassuring smile, but fear was settling deep in his bones. The weeks leading up to the trial were a blur of brief meetings, with Walsh, who always seemed distracted and unprepared. Each time Darius brought up his alibi, Walsh found reasons not to pursue it. The diner owner won't be credible. We don't have resources to gather and analyze security footage. We need to focus on discrediting the prosecution's case, not building our own. Finally, the trial began. Darius sat beside Walsh, watching as potential jurors were questioned. He couldn't help noticing that whenever a potential juror expressed concerns about racial bias in the justice system, they were quickly dismissed, usually after the prosecutor used one of her peremptory challenges, though sometimes at Calloway's own discretion for cause. The resulting jury consisted of 10 white people and 2 black people, both of whom seemed uncomfortable from the moment they were seated. District Attorney Victoria Reynolds opened with a devastating narrative. She paced before the jury, her voice confident and her gestures precise. Brandon Keller was an influential businessman, yes, but more importantly, he was a son, a brother, and a pillar of this community, she began. On April 15th, he went to check on renovations at one of his properties. Hours later, he was found dead, electrocuted by a deliberately tampered electrical panel. She turned, pointing directly at Darius. The defendant, Darius Wilson, had access to that panel. He had the knowledge to make it deadly, and most importantly, he had motive. Brandon Keller had recently questioned Mr. Wilson's work, suggesting his position might be in jeopardy after multiple complaints from tenants. Reynolds displayed work orders on a large screen. These documents show that Mr. Wilson was the last person to work on that panel. What they don't show, what we discovered during our investigation, is that he deliberately created a death trap, waiting for the moment when Mr. Keller would be vulnerable. Darius leaned over to Walsh, whispering, "Urgently, those work orders are altered. That's not my signature on the last one." Walsh shushed him, barely glancing at the evidence being presented. When it was the defense's turn, Walsh rose slowly. His opening statement was disjointed and ineffective. He mentioned incorrect dates for Darius's employment history, stumbled over basic facts about electrical work, and failed to challenge the prosecution's timeline in any meaningful way. "My client is, innocent of these charges," Walsh concluded lamely. "The evidence will show, well, reasonable doubt at the very least." Darius watched in growing horror as Judge Calloway actually smirked during Walsh's fumbling presentation. He caught Zora's eye in the gallery and saw his own fear reflected there. The prosecution's first witness was a security guard from Keller's building. "And what did you see that evening?" Reynolds asked. "I saw a black man in work clothes leaving through the service entrance around 6 p.m., the guard testified. He had his head down, but he was about the defendant's height and build. "Did you see his face?" Reynolds pressed. "No, ma'am," the guard admitted, "but it could have been the defendant." "Objection. Leading," Walsh said, finally showing some life. "Sustained," Calloway ruled, but the damage was done. During cross-examination, Walsh asked only a few perfunctory questions, never pressing the guard on his vague description or asking about other visitors to the building that day. As the testimony continued, Darius became increasingly frustrated. He scribbled notes, pushing them toward Walsh, who mostly ignored them. Finally, when the prosecution presented a timeline that Darius knew was impossible, he leaned over and whispered urgently, "You need to object. I couldn't have been there. At 5:45, I was at the diner by then. There are witnesses." Judge Calloway's voice cut through the courtroom like a whip. "Mr. Wilson, you will refrain from speaking during testimony." "Your Honor, I'm simply consulting with my attorney," Darius replied, trying to keep his voice respectful. Calloway's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Wilson, in my courtroom, you speak when spoken to. One more outburst, and I'll hold you in contempt. Is that clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Darius said, feeling a chill at the unconcealed disdain in the judge's voice. The first day of trial ended with Darius feeling increasingly hopeless. As the bailiffs prepared to take him back to his cell, he noticed Judge Calloway and DA Reynolds leaving the courtroom together, heads bent in conversation. They shared a laugh as they walked through the door. Looking at Walsh, who was hastily shoving papers into his briefcase, Darius asked, "Is that normal? The judge and prosecutor leaving together like that?" Walsh barely glanced up. "They probably have other cases to discuss." "They were laughing," Darius pressed. "Like they're friends." Walsh sighed. "Judge Calloway and Ms. Reynolds have worked together for years. It doesn't mean anything." But Darius wasn't convinced. As the bailiffs led him away, a cold fear settled in his stomach. Something was very wrong with his trial, and for the first time, he wondered if he would ever go home to Zora again. The morning after the first day of trial, while Darius sat in his cell contemplating his future, Judge Henry Calloway was enjoying the pristine green of Oakwood Country Club's golf course. The exclusive club, with its $100,000 membership fee, was a sanctuary for the city's elite, a place where deals were made, connections cemented, and certain conversations could happen away from prying eyes. Calloway adjusted his stance on the chew, third tee, eyeing the fairway ahead. Beside him stood Richard Keller, Brandon's father, looking immaculate in pressed khakis despite the early hour. "Beautiful morning," Calloway remarked, swinging his driver smoothly. The ball arced high against the blue sky, landing neatly in the center of the fairway. "Nice shot, Henry," Keller commented, stepping up to take his turn. "Almost as clean as the way you're handling our problem." Calloway smiled thinly. "The Wilson case is proceeding exactly as it should. The evidence is compelling." "Is it?" Keller asked, hitting his own ball with practiced precision. "I've heard whispers about an alibi, something about a diner." They began walking toward their balls, luxury carts left behind for the privacy their conversation required. "Nothing to worry about," Calloway assured him. "Walsh knows better than to pursue that angle too aggressively. And even if he tried, I'd find reason to exclude it. We need to make an example here, Richard. Can't have these people thinking they can interfere with progress." "Speaking of progress," Keller said, lowering his voice further, "the Riverside project is almost ready to launch. Once we've dealt with this unpleasantness, the demolition can begin. And my investment opportunity? The paperwork is ready. 10% equity in the development, held through offshore accounts, of course, plus the usual arrangement with Correct Life for any new residents." Calloway nodded with satisfaction. "This Wilson fellow should be worth about $40,000 to the facility. Prime working age, healthy. They'll get their money's worth." "A shame about Brandon," Keller said, his voice suddenly hard. "My son had his flaws, but he didn't deserve what happened." "No one's suggesting he did," Calloway replied carefully. "And justice will be served. Wilson will pay for what happened." "Whether he did it or not," Keller added in a whisper. Calloway didn't respond, but the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth was answer enough. Meanwhile, across town at Tantirosatima, the courthouse, Maya Evans was starting her day with a troubled mind. At 26, she was the youngest law clerk in Judge Calloway's chambers, a position that had initially filled her with pride. Growing up in a working-class black family, Maya had fought hard for her education, graduating near the top of her class from the state law school. When she'd landed the clerkship with Judge Calloway, her family had been thrilled. Only her grandmother had expressed reservation. "That man has a reputation," she'd warned. "Be careful, child." Now, 6 months into the position, Maya understood that warning. Sitting at her desk, surrounded by case files, she stared at the documents before her. Witness statements from the Wilson murder case that had been marked irrelevant in Calloway's handwriting, despite containing potentially exculpatory information. One statement in particular troubled her, from an electrician who had worked with Darius Wilson and confirmed that Wilson had repeatedly flagged safety issues in Keller properties, all of which had been ignored. "Is this normal procedure?" Maya asked Carol Winters, the senior clerk, a white woman in her 50s who had worked for Calloway for over a decade. Carol barely glanced at the documents. "Judge Calloway has his own system for evaluating evidence. It's not our place to question it. But these statements could be important to the defense," Maya persisted. Carol's expression hardened. "Maya, let me give you some advice. Judge Calloway rewards loyalty. If you want to advance in this courthouse, you need to understand how things work here. Some cases are sensitive. Sensitive? Important to certain people. Carol looked meaningfully at Maya. The Keller family has significant influence in this city. Their developments have revitalized whole neighborhoods. Gentrified them, you mean, Maya said, before she could stop herself. Carol's lips thinned. That's a matter of perspective. What isn't a matter of perspective is your job security. Just file the documents as marked. After Carol left, Maya continued sorting through the case files with growing unease. What she was seeing wasn't just judicial discretion. It was a pattern of bias that went beyond troubling into potentially illegal territory. Across town, Zora Wilson sat in her father's small office at the city's Public Works Department. As the daughter of a single father, she'd spent many afternoons here over the years, doing homework while Darius finished paperwork. The office manager, Helen Barnes, had always had a soft spot for Zora and had granted her access while her father was detained. "I'm not supposed to let you go through his computer," Helen said nervously, hovering at the door. "But I know your daddy, and there's no way he killed anyone. 10 minutes, Zora. That's all I can give you." "Thank you," Zora said, already logging into her father's email. She knew his password, her birthday followed by his mother's name. Darius Wilson was a creature of habit. Scrolling through his emails, Zora found what she was looking for, a folder labeled Keller Properties. Inside were dozens of emails spanning the past year, detailing safety concerns that Darius had documented in various Keller buildings. The most recent ones focused on the Riverside development, a massive project planned for one of the city's oldest black neighborhoods. In his final email, sent just 3 days before Brandon Keller's death, Darius had written, "Mr. Keller, I am formally documenting that the electrical plans for the Riverside development violate at least 6 major safety codes. The proposed wiring cannot support the outlined usage without significant risk of fire or electrocution. I cannot in good conscience sign off on these plans, and I am obligated to report these violations to the city inspector." There had been no response from Brandon Keller, but there was another email from Darius's supervisor warning him not to make waves with important clients like the Kellers. Zora quickly forwarded the emails to herself, her heart racing. This wasn't just about a murder charge. Her father had been trying to prevent a dangerous development that could have hurt people. As Helen gestured urgently that time was up, Zora logged out, her mind racing with this new information. Who could she tell? Who would believe a 17-year-old girl over the powerful Keller family? That same afternoon, Mel Johnson wiped down the counter of his diner for the 5th time that hour. A nervous habit he'd developed over the 30 years he'd owned the place. Mel's Diner was a community fixture in the predominantly black neighborhood where Darius Wilson lived, a place where local residents gathered for good food and conversation. Mel had watched the news about Darius's arrest with disbelief. Darius had indeed been in his diner at the time of the murder, sitting at his usual booth by the window, reading a paperback while he ate his usual Thursday special. Mel had planned to come forward, to tell the police what he'd seen, but then the visitors had arrived. 2 men in expensive suits, one flashing a private investigator's badge. They'd asked questions about Darius, about his regular visits, about what Mel might have seen that Thursday. "I'm just trying to get to the truth," the PI had said, but his partner's presence, silent, watching, hand casually resting inside his jacket, had conveyed a different message entirely. After they left, Mel had found his diner vandalized the next morning. The words "Keep your mouth shut" spray-painted across the front window. The message was clear. Now as he wiped the already clean counter, Mel fought an internal battle between self-preservation and doing right by a longtime customer who he knew was innocent. Late that evening, while most of the courthouse staff had gone home, Maya Evans remained in the archives, ostensibly researching precedents for another case. In reality, she was looking through Judge Calloway's past rulings, disturbed by a pattern she'd begun to notice, particularly harsh sentences for defendants from minority communities, especially in cases involving property or businesses owned by the city's elite. As she pulled another dusty file box from the shelf, she bumped into someone, a tall, distinguished-looking black man in his late 60s. "I'm sorry," Maya apologized, steadying the box. "No harm done," the man replied, then glanced at the label on the box. "Calloway's rulings from 2018. Interesting reading." Maya hesitated, eyeing the stranger cautiously. "Just research." "Of course." The man studied her thoughtfully. "You're his new clerk, aren't you? Maya Evans, if I'm not mistaken." "How do you know my name?" The man smiled, though there was sadness in his eyes. "I make it my business to know who works for Henry Calloway. I'm Elijah Banks. I used to sit on the bench myself." "Judge Banks," Maya said, recognition dawning. "You retired about 5 years ago." "Retired is one way to put it," Banks said enigmatically. He nodded toward the box in her hands. "If you're interested in Calloway's judicial patterns, you might want to look at State v. Johnson. It was one of his more revealing decisions." He reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. "Be careful what you're digging into, Ms. Evans. Some truths come with consequences. If you ever need to talk, my door is open." Before Maya could respond, Banks walked away, leaving her staring at his card and wondering exactly what he knew about Judge Calloway. That night, 2 members of the jury in Darius Wilson's trial received unexpected deliveries to their homes. Juror number 4, Sarah Whitaker, a kindergarten teacher, found a manila envelope on her doorstep containing photos of her walking her children to school, along with their daily schedule. Juror number 9, Michael Collins, a bank teller, received similar photos of his elderly mother's nursing home, with a note simply reading, "We know where to find those you care about." Neither juror reported these deliveries to the court. Both understood the implicit message: find Darius Wilson guilty or face consequences. The next morning, Darius sat in a small conference room at the detention center, waiting for Walsh to arrive for their scheduled meeting. When the lawyer finally appeared, 40 minutes late, his usual distracted demeanor had been replaced by something more focused and determined. "Mr. Wilson," Walsh began without preamble, "the prosecution has offered a plea deal. 25 years, possibility of parole after 15. Given the evidence against you, I strongly recommend you take it." Darius stared at him in disbelief. "I'm innocent. I didn't kill Brandon Keller. Why would I accept 25 years for something I didn't do?" "Because the alternative is life without parole," Walsh said bluntly. "Or possibly the death penalty, if the DA decides to pursue it." The evidence is manipulated," Darius interrupted. "Those work orders don't have my real signature. There's security footage from Mel's diner that would prove I was there. I've told you this repeatedly, but you haven't followed up on any of it." Walsh's expression hardened. "Mr. Wilson, I've been practicing law for 15 years. I know what evidence holds up in court and what doesn't. Security footage can be questioned. The timestamp could be wrong. Alibi witnesses can be discredited, especially when they're friends or regular establishments you frequent. So what am I supposed to do? Plead guilty to a crime I didn't commit?" Walsh leaned forward. "You're supposed to be realistic. We're in Judge Calloway's court. He has one of the highest conviction rates in the state, especially for defendants like you." "Defendants like me?" Darius repeated, anger rising. "You mean black men?" Walsh didn't deny it. "I'm trying to help you, Darius. 25 years is better than life. You could still see your daughter graduate college, maybe even meet your grandchildren someday." Darius stood up, rage and desperation warring within him. "I won't plead guilty to murder. I will not confess to killing a man I didn't kill. I want a new lawyer." "That's your right," Walsh said coldly, gathering his papers. "But no other public defender will tell you differently. And you can't afford a private attorney, can you?" "Get out," Darius said quietly. Walsh stood. "The offer expires tomorrow. After that, we go to trial with what we have, which isn't much. If you insist on fighting this, then you're on your own." As the door closed behind Walsh, Darius put his head in his hands. The system that was supposed to presume his innocence seemed designed to ensure his conviction. For the first time since his arrest, he allowed himself to truly consider the possibility that he might spend the rest of his life in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The realization was like ice in his veins. Zora would grow up without him. He would become just another black man swallowed by a justice system that was anything but just. The unfairness of it all threatened to overwhelm him. But then he thought of his daughter, her strength, her intelligence, her determination. She wouldn't give up on him, and he couldn't give up on himself. Walsh might have abandoned him. The system might be rigged against him. But Darius Wilson was innocent, and somewhere out there was the truth. He just had to hope it would come to light before it was too late. The second week of trial began with a heaviness in the air. As Darius was led into the courtroom, he noticed the jurors avoiding eye contact, their faces etched with attention. That hadn't been there before. He wondered if they could sense what he already knew. This wasn't a fair fight. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Calloway entered, his black robes billowing behind him. The judge settled into his chair with the comfortable air of a man who knew he controlled the room. "The prosecution may call its next witness," Calloway announced, nodding toward D.A. Reynolds. "The state calls Dr. Philip Goodwin," Reynolds said. Thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and salt-and-pepper hair approached the stand. After being sworn in, he settled into the witness chair with the ease of someone who had testified many times before. "Dr. Goodwin, please state your credentials for the court," Reynolds began. "I have a Ph.D. in electrical engineering from MIT and have worked as a forensic consultant for 20 years, specializing in electrical accidents and deliberate sabotage cases." Maya Evans, sitting near the back of the courtroom, frowned slightly as she opened her laptop. She'd been troubled enough by what she'd seen in Judge Calloway's chambers to begin attending the trial during her lunch breaks. Now she quickly searched Dr. Goodwin's name, scanning through the results with growing concern. On the stand, Goodwin was presenting his findings with absolute certainty. "There is no question that the electrical panel was deliberately tampered with," he stated, pointing to photographs displayed on a large screen. The wiring was reconfigured in a way that created a lethal trap. When Mr. Keller touched the panel, he received a massive electrical shock that stopped his heart instantly. "And in your expert opinion," Reynolds asked, "would this reconfiguration have happened by accident?" "Absolutely not," Goodwin declared. "This was intentional, requiring specific knowledge of electrical systems. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and what the result would be." Darius leaned toward Walsh, whispering urgently, "That's not right. The panel in that building was already dangerous. I filed reports about it months ago." Walsh shushed him, barely taking notes as the testimony continued. "And based on the work orders provided by Keller Properties," Reynolds continued, "who was the last person to access this electrical panel? According to the documentation, it was the defendant, Darius Wilson," Goodwin replied. "Objection," Walsh said half-heartedly. "The work order alone doesn't prove my client actually performed the work. The signature on the work order would indicate—" "Otherwise, Counselor," Judge Calloway replied. "Overruled." Maya's research had turned up something concerning. Dr. Goodwin had testified in 14 previous cases in Judge Calloway's court. In each one, his testimony had supported the prosecution, and in each one, the defendant had been convicted. More troublingly, 3 of those cases had involved properties owned by Keller Developments. During cross-examination, Walsh barely challenged Goodwin's credentials or conclusions, asking only basic questions that allowed the expert to further emphasize his damning testimony. Darius watched in growing frustration, the list of questions he wanted asked growing longer by the minute. After Goodwin stepped down, Reynolds called her next witness. The state calls Sandra Coleman, Human Resources Director for the City Public Works Department. A middle-aged white woman took the stand, clutching a personnel file that Darius recognized as his own. "Ms. Coleman, how long has the defendant worked for the city?" Reynolds asked. "Mr. Wilson has been employed as an electrician for almost 15 years, Coleman replied. "And during that time, has he had any disciplinary issues?" Coleman opened the file. "Yes. Over the past 2 years, Mr. Wilson has received 3 formal reprimands." Darius stiffened. Those reprimands had come after he'd refused to sign off on unsafe electrical work, including projects for Keller Properties. "And what was the nature of these reprimands?" Reynolds asked. "Insubordination primarily," Coleman said. refusing to complete assigned work, challenging his supervisors, that sort of thing. Was Mr. Wilson in danger of losing his position? After the third reprimand, yes. One more incident would have triggered a termination review. Reynolds turned to the jury. So the defendant's job was on the line because of his behavior. And who requested the most recent disciplinary action against Mr. Wilson? That would be Brandon Keller, Coleman said. He filed a complaint stating that Mr. Wilson was difficult to work with and was delaying important projects with unnecessary concerns. Reynolds smiled slightly. No further questions. When Walsh rose for cross-examination, Darius hoped he would finally highlight the real reason for those reprimands. Instead, the defense attorney asked only perfunctory questions about general job performance before sitting down again. Unable to contain himself, Darius tugged at Walsh's sleeve. You need to ask about the safety violations. Those reprimands came because I refused to sign off on dangerous work. Walsh shrugged him off, but Judge Calloway had noticed the exchange. Mr. Wilson, you will refrain from coaching your attorney. This is your final warning. Your Honor, Darius said, rising to his feet despite Walsh trying to pull him back down. Those reprimands were because I reported safety violations in Keller buildings. There are documents. Mr. Wilson, Calloway's voice cracked like a whip. You will sit down immediately. Security footage from the buildings would show I wasn't there when... Bailiff, Calloway called, and the cameras at Mel's Diner would prove I was there during the murder. Judge Calloway's face had turned an alarming shade of red. Mr. Wilson, you are in contempt of court. Bailiff, remove the jury. As the jurors filed out, many looking back with curious expressions, Calloway leaned forward on his bench, staring down at Darius with undisguised contempt. Men like you always think you're too smart to get caught, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. In my experience, that arrogance is what lands you right where you are. You will spend the night in a holding cell to reconsider your behavior. We will resume tomorrow, and if you cannot control yourself, you will watch the remainder of your trial from a separate room. Is that clear? Darius stood straight, meeting the judge's gaze. Yes, Your Honor. As the bailiffs led him away, Darius caught sight of Zora's stricken face in the gallery. Beside her, a young black woman he didn't recognize was watching the proceedings, with an expression of growing alarm. What Darius didn't know was that this was Maya Evans, and what she had just witnessed had pushed her from concern to certainty that something was deeply wrong with this trial. That evening, local news coverage painted a damning picture of the day's events. Accused murderer Darius Wilson disrupted court proceedings today, the anchor reported over footage of Darius being led away by bailiffs. Wilson, who has a previous record including a misdemeanor assault charge from 20 years ago, is accused of killing prominent developer Brandon Keller, described by colleagues as a visionary businessman who was revitalizing struggling neighborhoods. No mention was made of Darius's claims about safety violations or his alibi. The story was accompanied by an unflattering mugshot of Darius, alongside a professional portrait of Brandon Keller, smiling in an expensive suit. The next morning, Darius returned to court, determined to maintain his composure despite the growing hopelessness he felt. The trial resumed with the prosecution calling a security expert who testified about the mysteriously malfunctioning security cameras at Keller's building on the day of the murder. It appears the system was temporarily disabled, the expert explained. Not unusual in cases where someone doesn't want to be recorded. Walsh barely cross-examined this witness as well, failing to point out that Darius would have had no access to the security system or knowledge of how to disable it. When the prosecution called their electrical expert, Leonard Bridges, Darius recognized him immediately. They had worked together on several city projects, and Bridges had consistently cut corners to save money. In your professional opinion, Reynolds asked, do these schematics indicate proper electrical work? Bridges examined the diagrams with a show of careful consideration. No. Whoever wired this panel deliberately created a death trap. The insulation was stripped in places it should never be, creating the potential for a fatal shock if anyone touched the panel. And would the defendant have known this was dangerous? Absolutely. Any licensed electrician would recognize this as deadly. This wasn't a mistake, it was intentional. Darius gripped the edge of the table, forcing himself to remain silent even as Bridges blatantly misrepresented industry standards. When Walsh rose for cross-examination, his questions showed a complete lack of understanding about electrical work, allowing Bridges to further entrench his damaging testimony. During the afternoon recess, one of the jurors, a middle-aged white woman named Patricia Miller, approached the judge's bench with a concerned expression. "Your Honor, I'm confused about something in the timeline. If Mr. Wilson was at the building at 5:45 as the prosecution claims, but the medical examiner said death occurred between 6:15 and 6:30, wouldn't that mean Mr. Wilson wasn't present when Mr. Keller actually died?" Judge Calloway's expression hardened. "Juror number 5, you are to consider only the evidence formally presented in court. Any discrepancies will be addressed by the attorneys if relevant. Your job is to evaluate the evidence as presented, not to create your own theories. But if you cannot follow the court's instructions," Calloway continued, his voice taking on a warning tone, "you may not be suitable to continue serving on this jury." "Do I make myself clear?" The juror paled. "Yes, Your Honor." Later that afternoon, Maya Evans was filing court documents when she came across something that made her blood run cold. A printout of an email exchange between Judge Calloway and Richard Keller that had accidentally been included with other case materials. "The electrician knows too much," Richard had written. "Brandon was concerned about his snooping before the incident. We need to handle this situation definitively." Calloway's response was brief, but chilling. "Leave it to me. The Wilson situation will be resolved permanently." Maya's hands trembled as she quickly photographed the document with her phone before returning it to the file. This wasn't just judicial bias, it was criminal conspiracy. The final bombshell of the day came when Reynolds presented a signed statement allegedly from Darius, admitting he had been angry with Brandon Keller over the disciplinary actions. "I acknowledge that I blamed Brandon Keller for threatening my job," Reynolds read from the document. "I was angry and believed he was treating me unfairly." "That's not my signature," Darius burst out, unable to contain himself. "Mr. Wilson," Calloway warned, "control yourself." "Your Honor, I never signed that statement. It's forged." Calloway banged his gavel. "Mr. Wilson, one more outburst and you will be removed from this courtroom." Darius fell silent, but the damage was done. Looking at the jury, he could see several members now viewing him with suspicion and fear. The forged confession had achieved its purpose, convincing the jury that he had motive and was now lying to cover it up. As the day ended and Darius was taken back to his cell, he felt a growing sense of despair. No one was fighting for him. Not his attorney, not the system that was supposed to presume his innocence. The truth seemed to be slipping further away with each passing hour. What Darius didn't know was that someone had been watching the proceedings with growing concern. In the back of the courtroom, former Judge Elijah Banks had observed the entire day's testimony, his expression darkening with each procedural violation and manipulation of evidence. The time for merely watching, he decided, was over. Elijah Banks sat alone in his study, surrounded by files and legal papers accumulated over decades of work in the justice system. At 68, his once black hair had turned silver, and lines of experience creased his face, but his mind remained sharp. Sharp, enough to recognize a grave injustice when he saw one. Watching Darius Wilson's trial had brought back painful memories. 15 years earlier, Elijah had been a respected judge, mentoring a promising but ambitious Henry Calloway. Back then, Calloway had shown signs of cutting corners, but Elijah had hoped guidance would steer him toward ethical practice. That hope had died one evening when Elijah, working late, had witnessed Calloway accepting an envelope from a wealthy defendant whose case he was presiding over. When confronted, Calloway had been unapologetic. "This is how the world works, Elijah," he had said. "Some people deserve breaks, others don't. It's not personal, it's practical." When Elijah had threatened to report him, Calloway's response had been chilling. "Before you do that, you might want to think about your son." Elijah's son, Marcus, had been facing minor drug charges at the time, the kind that could be treated, leniently or harshly depending on the judge. The threat had been clear. Elijah had backed down, But he'd also begun documenting Calloway's misconduct, building a file that had grown thicker over the years. 6 months later, Elijah had been forced into early retirement after a manufactured scandal involving case assignments. He had lost his position, but he'd kept his records, waiting for the right moment to use them. Now, looking at the news coverage of Darius Wilson's trial, Elijah recognized the same patterns: the rushed proceedings, the suppressed evidence, the manipulation of the system to secure a predetermined outcome. It was Calloway's signature approach, refined over years of unchecked corruption. But this time, Elijah had an unexpected ally. The knock on his door came just after 7 p.m. When he opened it, he found Maya Evans standing on his porch, clutching her purse tightly, her expression a mixture of determination and fear. "Judge Banks," she said, "I'm sorry to come unannounced, but I need to talk to you about Judge Calloway." Elijah stepped back, inviting her in. "I've been expecting someone from his chambers to reach out eventually, though I admit I didn't think it would be so soon." Maya followed him into the study, her eyes widening at the wall of files labeled with case numbers and dates. "What is all this?" "Insurance," Elijah replied simply. "Or evidence, depending on how you look at it. 15 years of Henry Calloway's judicial misconduct, documented as thoroughly as I could manage from the outside." Maya pulled out her phone, showing him the photograph of the email exchange she'd discovered. "Then you'll want to add this to your collection." Elijah studied the image, his expression grim. "This goes beyond bias or corruption. This is conspiracy to frame an innocent man." "I've been watching the Wilson trial," Maya said. "Everything about it feels wrong. The evidence doesn't line up, the defense attorney is barely trying, and Judge Calloway—" She hesitated. "Say it," Elijah encouraged. "He's ensuring a guilty verdict. I don't know why, but he's determined to send Darius Wilson to prison, regardless of the evidence." Elijah nodded, moving to a file cabinet and pulling out a thick folder. "The why is always the same with Henry: money and power. The question is, who benefits from Wilson's conviction?" "Richard Keller," Maya said immediately. "Brandon's father. I've heard Judge Calloway has investments in Keller Properties." "More than just properties," Elijah said, placing several documents before her. "Calloway owns shares in Correct Life Facilities, a private prison company that receives government funding based on their inmate population. Each new prisoner means more money. And who sits on the board of Correct Life? Richard Keller." Maya sank into a chair, the full weight of the corruption beginning to dawn on her. "So this isn't just about one murder case?" "No," Elijah confirmed. "It's a system. Calloway sentences primarily minority defendants to long terms at Correct Life, where they become essentially free labor. The Kellers develop properties in revitalized neighborhoods after the original residents have been displaced, sometimes through legitimate means, sometimes through manufactured criminal charges. Like Darius Wilson." "Exactly. But Wilson is different. Based on what I've gathered, he wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time, he was actively flagging safety violations in Keller Properties. He was a threat to their business model." Maya looked at the wall of evidence with growing determination. "We have to stop this, we have to help him." "It won't be easy," Elijah warned. "Calloway has powerful friends and a reputation for retaliating against anyone who challenges him." "I can't just watch an innocent man go to prison," Maya insisted. Elijah studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we have work to do." While Maya and Elijah began formulating a plan, Darius sat alone in his cell, writing a letter to Zora by the dim light available to him. "My dearest daughter," he wrote, his handwriting unsteady. "I don't know how this will end, but I need you to know the truth, no matter what happens in that courtroom. I did not kill Brandon Keller. I would never take another person's life." He paused, fighting back the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "If the worst happens, I need you to be strong. Finish school, go to college like we planned. Make the life for yourself that I always wanted you to have. Don't let my situation define your future." He continued writing, pouring his heart onto the page, uncertain if he would ever have the chance to tell her these things in person again. The next morning, In a small coffee shop across town, Elijah Banks spread several files before Maya. These are 12 cases where Callaway sentenced defendants to long prison terms for crimes that directly benefited Keller development projects. Maya scanned the documents, her horror growing. All of these people are still in prison? Every one of them, Elijah confirmed. Most at Correct Life facilities, and in each case their conviction cleared the way for a Keller property acquisition or development. This is... Maya struggled to find words adequate for the scope of the corruption. Criminal, Elijah supplied, and we're going to expose it all. But first, we need to save Darius Wilson while there's still time. Across town, another crisis of conscience was unfolding. Mel Johnson stood nervously on the doorstep of Tanya Wilson's modest home, where Zora had been staying since her father's arrest. When the door opened, Zora's hopeful expression quickly turned to confusion at the sight of the diner owner. "Mr. Johnson, what are you doing here?" Mel twisted his worn cap in his hands. "I need to talk to you about your father. Can I come in?" Once inside, Mel sank into a chair at the kitchen table, looking years older than his actual age. "I've been trying to do the right thing, but I'm scared, Zora. These are powerful people." "What are you talking about?" "Your father was at my diner the night Mr. Keller was killed. He came in around 5:15 like he always does on Thursdays. Had the special, read his book. He didn't leave until after 7. I know because I remember him asking about the game score before he left." Zora stared at him, hope and anger battling in her expression. "You're his alibi. Why haven't you come forward?" Mel's hands trembled slightly. "2 men came to see me the day after your father was arrested. They didn't directly threaten me, but the message was clear. The next morning, someone vandalized my diner. Keep your mouth shut, spray painted across the front window. But you know he's innocent." "I do," Mel admitted, shame evident in his voice. "And I can't live with myself anymore letting an innocent man take the fall. But I'm scared, Zora. These people, the Kellers, they have influence everywhere." Zora reached across the table, gripping the older man's hand. "My father is facing life in prison for something he didn't do. Please, Mr. Johnson, we need your help." Mel took a deep breath, then nodded. "I'll testify, and my security cameras might still have the footage from that night. I never turn them over to anyone unless there's a formal subpoena, so the police never got them." For the first time in weeks, real hope bloomed in Zora's heart. Back at the courthouse, the trial resumed with the defense's case, such as it was. Walsh called only 2 character witnesses, both of whom he barely prepared. Their testimony was brief and ineffective, doing little to counter the prosecution's narrative. Then, to Darius's shock, Walsh announced, "The defense rests, Your Honor." "What?" Darius whispered urgently. "What about my alibi? What about Mel? What about the evidence of safety violations?" Walsh ignored him, packing his papers as if the matter was settled. Judge Callaway seemed pleased. "Very well. We will hear closing arguments tomorrow morning, and then the case will go to the jury." As the courtroom began to clear, Darius sat, stunned, the full weight of his situation crashing down on him. Walsh had effectively abandoned any real defense, ensuring his conviction. Without evidence of his alibi or the safety concerns he'd raised, the jury would only have the prosecution's version of events to consider. In the gallery, Elijah Banks watched the proceedings with a grim expression. As people filed out, he noticed Maya approaching him. "He's giving up," she whispered, nodding toward Walsh. "He's not even trying to defend his client." "He was never going to," Elijah replied quietly. "Walsh has been Callaway's puppet for years. He takes the cases Callaway wants controlled and ensures the right outcome." "How is this possible? How has no one stopped this?" "People have tried," Elijah said, his voice heavy with old grief. "They've been silenced, discredited, or worse. The system protects its own, especially when there's money involved." As they spoke, Maya noticed a woman approaching them, determined with red-rimmed eyes that suggested recent tears. It was Naomi Washington, an investigative journalist known for her uncompromising exposés on corruption. "Judge Banks," Naomi said, extending her hand. "I got your message. You said you have evidence of judicial corruption that goes beyond anything I've seen before. Elijah nodded. Ms. Washington, this is Maya Evans, a clerk in Judge Calloway's chambers. She's been gathering evidence from the inside. Naomi turned to Maya with new interest. A whistleblower? That changes everything. I've been tracking corruption in the city's justice system for years, but hard evidence has been difficult to come by. I have emails, documentation of evidence tampering, patterns of case assignments, Maya said. And Judge Banks has years of records showing a clear pattern of bias and corruption. I'll need to verify everything, Naomi warned. I can't publish without rock-solid evidence. You'll have it, Elijah promised. But we're in a race against time. Darius Wilson's case is going to the jury tomorrow, and once they reach a verdict, it becomes much harder to overturn. Naomi finished. I understand the urgency. As they talked, none of them noticed the young woman watching them from across the hallway, Zora Wilson, who had been searching for anyone who might help her father. Seeing the former judge deep in conversation with the court clerk and a woman she recognized from local news, Zora felt the first stirring of hope that she wasn't fighting alone. Meanwhile, the jury had begun their deliberations, sequestered in a conference room with the evidence presented during the trial. Most seemed resigned to a guilty verdict, given the seemingly overwhelming evidence. However, juror number 5, Patricia Miller, who had questioned the timeline, remained troubled. Something doesn't add up, she insisted to her fellow jurors. The prosecution's own timeline has holes in it. The judge told us to focus on the evidence presented, another juror reminded her, and the evidence all points to Wilson. Patricia frowned. But what about? She was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. The bailiff entered with a message. Judge Calloway requested they adjourn for the day and resume deliberations in the morning. As the jurors were escorted to their hotel, Patricia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being rushed toward a predetermined conclusion. The pressure to convict was palpable, from the judge's instructions to the threatening package she'd received at her home, a package she'd been too frightened to report. Late that evening, Maya happened to be working late, filing last-minute motions for another case, when she overheard Judge Calloway on the phone in his chambers. The door was slightly ajar, and his voice carried clearly. It'll be over by tomorrow, Richard. Your son's killer will get what he deserves. The jury knows what's expected of them. There was a pause as Calloway listened to the other end of the conversation. The Riverside project can proceed on schedule. Once this is wrapped up, the last obstacle will be removed. Another pause. No, Walsh did exactly as instructed. Minimal defense, no mention of the alibi or safety violations. Wilson will go away for life, and the whole matter will be forgotten. Maya stood frozen, her phone in hand, recording every word. This was the final piece of evidence they needed. Calloway explicitly discussing the railroading of an innocent man to benefit a development project. As she backed away from the door, planning to meet Elijah and Naomi with this new evidence, Maya realized the full weight of what they were uncovering. This wasn't just about saving Darius Wilson anymore. It was about exposing a corrupt system that had been destroying lives for years, and they had less than 24 hours before the jury delivered a verdict that would send an innocent man to prison for life. The courthouse had emptied for the night, its grand hallways silent under the dim glow of security lights. Maya Evans stood alone at the entrance to Judge Calloway's chambers, heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at her watch, 11:22 p.m. The night guard, Frank, would be making his rounds on the 3rd floor for the next 15 minutes, giving her a narrow window of opportunity. She'd volunteered to stay late, claiming a backlog of filing that couldn't wait until morning. Now, with trembling hands, she inserted her keycard into the door's electronic lock. The small light blinked green, and Maya took a deep breath before slipping inside. Calloway's chambers were opulent compared to the utilitarian offices of other court staff, leather furniture, mahogany bookshelves, and large windows overlooking the city. Maya moved quickly to his desk, pulling out her phone to use as a flashlight. Elijah's instructions had been clear. Find concrete evidence linking Calloway to the Kellers and Correct Life facilities. Start with his personal files, Elijah had told her. Calloway is arrogant enough to keep records. He believes he's untouchable. Maya began methodically searching the desk drawers, careful to leave everything exactly as she found it. Most contained standard legal papers and court documents, nothing incriminating. Frustration mounted as precious minutes ticked by. Then she noticed the painting behind Calloway's desk, an oil landscape of a golf course that seemed oddly out of place among the more sophisticated artwork decorating the rest of the chambers. On a hunch, Maya carefully lifted the painting from its hook, revealing a small wall safe. "Of course," she whispered. The combination would be the challenge, but Maya had worked for Calloway long enough to know his habits. She tried his birthday. Nothing. His law school graduation year, still nothing. Then she remembered the numbers he used for his computer password, which she'd glimpsed months ago. 0900878. The date his father had been appointed to the bench. The safe clicked open. Inside were several envelopes stuffed with cash, each marked with initials and dates. Maya quickly photographed them, noting that many bore the initials RK, with dates corresponding to major Keller development project approvals. Deeper in the safe, she found a flash drive and a folder containing photographs of Calloway with Richard Keller at various private events, golf outings, yacht parties, exclusive dinners. Maya's hands shook as she documented everything, knowing that each photo might be the evidence needed to save Darius Wilson. She was so focused on her task that she almost missed the sound of a key turning in the outer door. Panic shot through her as she quickly replaced the contents, closed the safe, and rehung the painting. There was nowhere to hide except under Calloway's massive desk. Maya squeezed herself into the knee space, pulling the chair in as much as possible to conceal her presence. The door opened, and heavy footsteps entered the room. Maya held her breath, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it might give her away. "Just checking all the offices, standard procedure," came Frank's voice, speaking into his radio. "Judge Calloway's chambers are clear." Maya remained frozen, as the guard shone his flashlight around the room, the beam passing inches from her hiding spot. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, and the door closed again. She waited another full minute before emerging, her legs cramped. From the awkward position, the close call had shaken her, but there was still work to do. Maya moved to Calloway's computer, which required another password. Using the same numbers, she gained access and began searching through his files. Most were password protected, but his email was still logged in. Maya scrolled through, looking for communications with Keller. What she found exceeded her expectations. Dozens of emails discussing how to handle Darius's case, including explicit instructions from Calloway to the prosecutor about which evidence to emphasize and which to suppress. One email thread between Calloway and Richard Keller discussed jury selection, with Keller writing, "Make sure we get the right people, suggestible, respectful of authority, and preferably with financial interests that align with development projects." Most damning was an email sent just after Brandon Keller's death where Richard wrote, "Need to ensure the electrician takes the fall. Too many questions otherwise. He knows about the substandard materials we used in Riverside. Handle it." Maya photographed everything, her hands steadier now as righteous anger replaced fear. She was so engrossed in documenting the emails that she almost missed another sound, this time from the hallway. Quickly logging out, Maya retreated to a shadowy corner as the janitor, Luis, pushed his cleaning cart past the partially open door. He paused, peering inside. "Hello? Somebody working late?" Maya held her breath, pressing herself against the wall behind a tall bookcase. Luis took a few steps into the room, looking around with a puzzled expression. "Could have sworn I heard something," he muttered before shrugging and backing out, closing the door behind him. Maya released her breath, her heart racing again. She'd been in the chambers far too long already. After a final check to ensure everything was exactly as she'd found it, she slipped out, carefully locking the door behind her. The next morning, while the jury continued their deliberations, Zora Wilson sat in a small coffee shop across from Naomi Washington. The journalist listened intently as the 17-year-old explained her discovery of the emails documenting her father's safety concerns. "He was trying to protect people," Zora said. her voice firm despite her youth. The Kellers were using substandard materials in the Riverside development. Dad said the electrical work was dangerous, that it could cause fires or electrocutions. Naomi nodded, taking detailed notes. And you believe that's why they targeted your father? I know it is. Brandon Keller filed a complaint against him. Just days before he died. He was trying to get my dad fired for refusing to sign off on the safety inspections. Do you have copies of these emails? Zora slid a USB drive across the table. Everything I found on his work computer. The city will probably claim I shouldn't have accessed it, but I don't care anymore. They're framing my father for murder. Naomi pocketed the drive, her expression softening. You're very brave, Zora. Not many people would fight this hard against such powerful opponents. He's all I have, Zora said simply, and he's innocent. As they talked, neither noticed the man watching them from a corner table, one of Richard Keller's security personnel, tasked with monitoring the Wilson family's movements. Meanwhile, Maya met with Elijah in his home office, sharing her findings from the previous night. This goes deeper than I imagined, Elijah said, examining the photographs of the cash payments and emails. Calloway isn't just biased, he's actively participating in a criminal conspiracy. There's more, Maya said, opening her laptop. I did some financial research this morning. Walsh, the public defender, has received large deposits to an offshore account after each case where his client was convicted in Calloway's court. She showed him the records, tracing the payments through shell companies that ultimately connected back to Keller Investments. They're paying him to lose cases, Elijah said, his expression grim. This isn't just about Darius Wilson. How many innocent people have been sent to prison because of this arrangement? Dozens at least. I found records going back 8 years. Maya hesitated. What happens when we expose this? The fallout will be enormous. Justice happens, Elijah replied firmly, no matter the cost. That evening, an emergency meeting convened at Elijah's home. Maya and Naomi arrived first, followed by Zora and a nervous-looking Mel Johnson, who kept glancing out the windows as if expecting to be followed. I brought the security footage, Mel said, placing a small hard drive on the table. From my diner, it clearly shows Mr. Wilson was there from 5:18 until 7:12 p.m. on the day of the murder. He couldn't possibly have been at the Keller building. Naomi connected the drive to her laptop, confirming the footage showed Darius exactly where he claimed to be during the critical time period. This is definitive proof of his innocence, she said. Combined with the emails about safety violations and the documented corruption, we have enough to blow this case wide open. The question is timing, Elijah said. The jury could reach a verdict any moment. Once they do, it becomes much harder to overturn even with new evidence. Maya nodded. We need to act now. The verdict is expected tomorrow. I'm ready to publish, Naomi said. I've verified enough of the evidence to stand behind the story. And I'm ready to testify about what I saw, Mel added, though his voice trembled slightly. There's one more thing, Elijah said, his expression somber. I need to tell you why this is personal for me. The group fell silent as Elijah retrieved a framed photograph from his desk. A young black man in a graduation cap and gown, smiling proudly. This was my son, Marcus. 15 years ago, he was arrested on minor drug charges, possession of marijuana, a first offense that typically results in probation or a few months at most. Elijah's voice grew strained. His case went before Judge Calloway. Marcus received a 10-year sentence at Correct Life facilities. I knew it was excessive, knew something was wrong, but I was threatened into silence. He looked around the room, his eyes haunted. 3 years into his sentence, Marcus died in Correct Life prison. The official report called it a suicide, but a sympathetic guard told me he'd been beaten after complaining about work conditions. He was 23 years old. A heavy silence filled the room. Since that day, I've been building a case against Calloway and the Kellers. For years, I didn't have enough evidence to move forward. But now, with what we've gathered, he looked at each person in turn. This isn't just about saving Darius Wilson anymore. It's about justice for everyone these people have harmed. Maya reached out, placing her hand over Elijah's. We'll make it right. Naomi checked her watch. I need to get back to my office. I'll work through the night to prepare the article. It'll go live first thing tomorrow morning before the court session begins. As they finalized their plans, Maya felt a strange mixture of fear and determination. By this time tomorrow, everything would change for Darius Wilson, for Judge Calloway, and for herself. There would be no going back once they exposed the truth. In the darkness of his cell, Darius lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow the jury would likely deliver their verdict, and despite his unwavering knowledge of his own innocence, he had lost faith in the system's ability to recognize the truth. The evidence had been manipulated, his defense sabotaged, and the judge himself seemed determined to see him convicted. His thoughts turned to Zora, as they always did in his darkest moments. She was so young to face losing her father this way. He hoped she would understand someday that he had tried to do the right thing, reporting the safety violations, refusing to compromise his principles even when it would have been easier. What Darius couldn't know was that at that very moment, a small group of determined individuals was working through the night to ensure the truth would finally be heard. Naomi Washington sat at her desk, her third cup of coffee growing cold beside her, as she crafted what would be the most explosive article of her career. The headline on her screen read, "Corruption in the Courtroom: How Judge Calloway Sells Justice to the Highest Bidder." The article detailed the conspiracy between Judge Calloway, Richard Keller, and Correct Life Facilities, using the Darius Wilson case as its central example. She included photographs of the cash payments, excerpts from the damning emails, financial records showing the connections, and testimony from multiple sources. As dawn broke, Naomi published the article to her newspaper's website and sent links to every major news outlet in the country. Within minutes, it began to spread across social media platforms, each share expanding its reach. By the time the courthouse opened its doors, the story had gone viral. Judge Henry Calloway's morning routine had been the same for 20 years. A light breakfast, a careful shave, and a review of the day's docket while listening to the local news. This morning, however, was different. His phone had been buzzing incessantly since 5 a.m., but he'd ignored it, assuming it was related to some administrative matter that could wait. It wasn't until he turned on the television that his world began to collapse. "Breaking news this morning," the anchor announced, her expression unusually grave. "A bombshell report alleges widespread corruption in the city's justice system, centering on Judge Henry Calloway and real estate magnate Richard Keller." Calloway froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Investigative journalist Naomi Washington has published extensive evidence suggesting Judge Calloway has been accepting bribes to manipulate cases, particularly those involving Keller development projects. Most shocking are allegations that Darius Wilson, currently on trial for the murder of Brandon Keller, is being deliberately framed to prevent him from exposing dangerous safety violations in Keller properties. The cup slipped from Calloway's fingers, shattering on the kitchen floor. By the time he arrived at the courthouse, his phone had hundreds of missed calls and messages. Worse, a crowd of reporters had gathered outside, shouting questions as he pushed past them. "Judge Calloway, did you accept bribes from Richard Keller? Is it true you own shares in Correct Life Facilities? Have you been fixing cases for financial gain?" Calloway kept his head down, pushing through the throng with mounting panic. Inside, the normally respectful courthouse staff averted their eyes, their whispers following him down the hallway to his chambers. Carol Winters, his senior clerk, met him at the door, her face ashen. "Judge, there are FBI agents here. They're waiting in the conference room." "Tell them I'm in court." Calloway snapped. "The Wilson trial needs to conclude immediately." Carol looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I don't think—" "Just do as I say," he barked, straightening his robes and heading for his courtroom. The scene that greeted him was unlike anything he'd experienced in his judicial career. The gallery was packed, not with the usual handful of observers, but with reporters, legal watchdogs, and curious citizens drawn by the explosive allegations. Cameras flashed despite the court's prohibition, and the buzz of conversation died only reluctantly as he entered. "All rise," the bailiff called, though there was a new uncertainty in his voice. Calloway took his seat, forcing his expression into one of judicial sternness. "Be seated. Bailiff, please bring in the jury." As the jurors filed in, Calloway noticed their demeanor had changed dramatically from the previous day. They avoided looking at him directly, and several appeared visibly uncomfortable. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Calloway asked, eager to conclude the proceedings before the situation spiraled further out of control. The foreman, a middle-aged white man who had seemed so amenable to the prosecution's case earlier, stood slowly. "Your Honor, we have not reached a verdict. In fact," the courtroom doors burst open, interrupting the foreman as several men and women in dark suits entered. They moved with the unmistakable authority of federal agents. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Calloway demanded, banging his gavel. One of the newcomers stepped forward, holding up a badge. "FBI, Your Honor. I apologize for the interruption, but we have urgent business with the court." From the gallery, a reporter stood suddenly. "Judge Calloway, is it true you've been accepting bribes from Richard Keller to secure convictions that benefit his business interests?" "Silence," Calloway shouted, banging his gavel repeatedly. "This is contempt of court. Bailiff, remove that." "Person immediately." The bailiff hesitated, looking between the judge and the FBI agents with obvious uncertainty. District Attorney Victoria Reynolds rose quickly from the prosecution table. "Your Honor, in light of the serious allegations that have emerged this morning, the state requests a brief recess to assess the situation." Calloway glared at her. "You will continue with these proceedings, Counselor. These baseless accusations have no bearing on the matter before this court." "Actually, Your Honor," Reynolds replied, her voice cooling noticeably, "they have direct bearing if they suggest prosecutorial misconduct or judicial bias. The DA's office was unaware of any impropriety in these proceedings, and we take such allegations extremely seriously." Calloway could see Reynolds already distancing herself, preparing to save her own career at his expense. Before he could respond, there was movement from the defense table. Raymond Walsh, who had spent weeks barely defending his client, was slipping quietly toward a side door. "Mr. Walsh," Calloway called, "where do you think you're going?" Walsh froze, looking like a cornered animal. I need to use the restroom, Your Honor." "Return to your seat immediately," Calloway ordered. Instead, Walsh made a dash for the door, only to find his path blocked by 2 FBI agents. They took him by the arms, and he offered no resistance as they led him back to the defense table. The courtroom was devolving into chaos. The gallery buzzed with whispers and exclamations. The jury looked increasingly troubled, and Darius Wilson sat watching it all unfold with growing amazement. Suddenly, from the gallery, a tall, distinguished black man rose to his feet. "Your Honor, I request permission to address the court on a matter of grave importance." Calloway's blood ran cold as he recognized Elijah Banks. "This is highly irregular. We are in the middle of jury deliberations." As a former judge of this court, Banks continued undeterred, "I am compelled to present evidence of judicial misconduct that directly affects these proceedings." "You have no standing here," Calloway sputtered, his face reddening. "I believe the interests of justice give me standing," Banks replied calmly, approaching the bench with a thick folder. "This contains documented evidence of your financial relationships with Richard Keller and Correct Life Facilities, communications proving your deliberate manipulation of this case, and a pattern of similar misconduct stretching back 15 years. Calloway stood, rage overtaking his caution. "This is outrageous. Bailiff, remove Judge Banks from my courtroom." The bailiffs looked at each other uncertainly, making no move to follow the order. "You're done, Henry," Banks said quietly. "The truth is out." Calloway's composure finally shattered. "This is a conspiracy. You've always been jealous of my success. Elijah, you and your crusading ideals, while I understood how the world really works. Is that what you call perverting justice for profit?" Banks asked. "Understanding how the world works?" The FBI agent in charge stepped forward. "Judge Calloway, we have a warrant to search your chambers and home based on evidence of judicial corruption, evidence tampering, and conspiracy." "This is absurd," Calloway shouted, his voice cracking. I am a respected judge. I've served this community for decades. You can't come into my courtroom and Henry Calloway. A new voice rang out as Richard Keller burst through the doors, flanked by his own attorneys. Unlike his usual polished appearance, Keller looked disheveled, his face flushed with anger. You assured me this situation was contained. What the hell is happening? The courtroom fell silent at this unintentional admission of their collusion. Calloway stared at Keller in disbelief. Richard, for God's sake. The emails are everywhere, Keller continued, seemingly unaware of the damage he was doing. The offshore accounts, everything. You said no one would ever find. His attorney grabbed his arm, finally silencing him, but the damage was done. In the stunned silence that followed, juror number 5, Patricia Miller, rose to her feet. Your Honor, or perhaps I shouldn't call you that anymore. Several of us on the jury received threatening packages at our homes, photographs of our families, our daily routines. We were told without words what would happen if we didn't convict Mr. Wilson. Other jurors nodded, in agreement, some looking relieved that the intimidation was finally being acknowledged. We felt pressured throughout the trial, Patricia continued. When I raised questions about the evidence, you threatened to remove me from the jury. This hasn't been a fair trial, and we cannot in good conscience render a verdict under these circumstances. Calloway sank back into his chair, the full magnitude of his downfall beginning to register. His career, his reputation, his freedom, all crumbling before his eyes. From the gallery, Maya Evans watched with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The system she'd believed in had been corrupted, but today, perhaps, it was beginning to correct itself. The FBI agent approached the bench. Judge Calloway, please step down. You have no authority to remove me from my own courtroom, Calloway said, though the fight had gone out of his voice. Actually, he does, came a new voice from the doorway. Every head turned to see Judge Sarah Mitchell, the senior judge of the district court, enter the room. Her expression was grave as she approached the bench. Henry Calloway, in light of the serious allegations against you and the evidence that has been presented, I am temporarily relieving you of your judicial duties pending a full investigation. Calloway looked around at the faces turned toward him, faces that had once shown deference and respect, now displaying shock, disappointment, and in some cases, a grim satisfaction. His gaze finally landed on Darius Wilson, the man he had been so determined to convict. For the first time, Darius spoke directly to the judge, his voice calm and clear. All I ever wanted was the truth to be heard. Judge Mitchell turned to Darius. Mr. Wilson, given the extraordinary circumstances that have come to light, I am dismissing all charges against you with prejudice. You are free to go. For a moment, Darius couldn't move, the words he'd longed to hear almost incomprehensible after weeks of fighting against a system determined to convict him. As Calloway was led away by federal agents, his judicial robe seeming to hang more heavily on his shoulders, the courtroom erupted into activity. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Legal observers discussed the implications in excited tones, and Zora Wilson pushed through the crowd to embrace her father for the first time since his arrest. I knew you'd be cleared, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I never doubted it. Darius held his daughter tight, his own eyes wet. It's over, baby. We're going home. Behind them, Richard Keller was also being taken into custody, protesting loudly as reporters captured every moment of his humiliation. Elijah Banks approached the reunited family, extending his hand to Darius. Mr. Wilson, I'm deeply sorry for what you've endured. The system failed you terribly. You helped set it right, Darius replied, shaking the former judge's hand. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Elijah said soberly. What happened here today is just the beginning. The corruption goes deeper than Calloway and Keller. There will be a long road ahead to truly fix what's broken. Darius nodded, his arm still around Zora's shoulders. Then we'll walk that road, together. The truth matters, justice matters, and I'm not giving up on either. As they left the courthouse together, stepping into the sunlight of a day Darius had feared he might never see again, reporters swarmed around them, shouting questions. But for now, Darius had only one priority: going home with his daughter, and beginning to rebuild the life that had nearly been stolen from him. Behind them, the wheels of a different kind of justice had begun to turn, one that would soon expose decades of corruption, free the wrongfully convicted, and perhaps finally bring true equality to a system that had for too long served the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. The courthouse steps had become a stage for one of the most dramatic scenes in the city's history. News cameras captured every moment as federal agents escorted Henry Calloway through the main doors, his hands cuffed in front of him. The black judicial robes that had once symbolized his authority were gone, replaced by the ordinary suit that suddenly made him look smaller, more vulnerable, just a man facing the consequences of his actions. Reporters shouted questions that went unanswered as Calloway was guided toward an unmarked FBI vehicle. His face, usually composed and superior, now showed the shock of a man watching his carefully constructed world crumble around him. As they reached the bottom of the steps, Calloway and his federal escorts passed Darius Wilson, who stood with Zora by his side. The two men's eyes met briefly. In that moment, the power dynamic that had defined their relationship in the courtroom was completely reversed. "In my experience, Judge," Darius said quietly, his voice carrying in the sudden lull, "it's not arrogance that gets you caught. It's believing you're above the law." Calloway's face tightened, but he said nothing as the agents guided him into the waiting vehicle. The door closed with a final-sounding thud, and the car pulled away from the curb, taking with it a man who had wielded almost unlimited power just hours earlier. Naomi Washington approached Darius, microphone in hand. "Mr. Wilson, how does it feel to be exonerated after what you've been through?" Darius looked thoughtful, his arm still protectively around Zora's shoulders. "Honestly, it feels like waking up from a nightmare. I always knew I was innocent, but for a while there it seemed like the truth didn't matter. Today showed that it does, eventually." "Will you be pursuing legal action against the city or Judge Calloway personally?" "That's a conversation for another day," Darius replied. "Right now I just want to go home with my daughter." As Darius and Zora made their way through the crowd, Maya Evans and Elijah Banks watched from the courthouse entrance, both experiencing their own complex emotions about the day's events. "Is it enough?" Maya asked quietly. "After everything Calloway has done, all the lives he's ruined?" "It's a beginning," Elijah replied. "The real work starts now." The real work began immediately. While Darius was reunited with his freedom, teams of FBI agents descended on multiple locations across the city: Calloway's home, his vacation property, the offices of Keller Developments, and the administrative headquarters of Correct Life Facilities. The evidence they uncovered exceeded even what Maya and Elijah had discovered. At Calloway's lakeside home, agents found a hidden room containing financial records detailing bribes and kickbacks stretching back over a decade. The documents revealed payoffs from developers, business owners, and others, with cases before Calloway's court, with the largest and most consistent payments coming from Richard Keller. In Calloway's personal safe, they discovered a ledger containing the names of every person he had wrongfully sentenced, along with the value each conviction had brought him, financial and otherwise. Most disturbing were his notes about certain defendants, including Darius. "Troublemaker, knows too much, maximum sentence required." At Keller Developments, the investigation uncovered evidence of widespread fraud, environmental violations, and deliberate use of substandard materials in projects throughout the city, exactly what Darius had reported and been framed for exposing. Most damning discoveries came from Correct Life Facilities. Documents revealed a commission structure where judges received $40,000 for each inmate sentenced to their prisons, with bonuses for healthy individuals who could work in their manufacturing operations. The company had been using what amounted to slave labor, paying inmates pennies per hour while charging government contracts for rehabilitation programs. Within days, the scandal had expanded beyond Calloway and Keller. Lower-level officials began making deals, offering information in exchange for leniency. Raymond Walsh was among the first, revealing how he had deliberately tanked cases for defendants Calloway wanted convicted. "I was instructed to provide the appearance of a defense without any substance," Walsh admitted to federal prosecutors. In the Wilson case specifically, I was told to ignore the alibi evidence and avoid challenging the prosecution's timeline or physical evidence. Walsh's bank records showed deposits totaling over $2 million over the years, all traced back to shell companies connected to Keller Investments. Victoria Reynolds, the district attorney, attempted to distance herself from the scandal, claiming she had no knowledge of the corruption. This defense crumbled when investigators discovered emails where she and Calloway discussed which cases needed special handling and how evidence could be presented to ensure the desired outcomes. As the investigation expanded, more people came forward with their stories. Former defendants who had faced Calloway's biased justice, families who had lost loved ones to excessive sentences, community members who had been displaced by Keller's developments, all added their voices to the growing chorus demanding accountability. Perhaps, most significantly, current and former Correct Life inmates began sharing their experiences. Many had been sentenced by Calloway for minor offenses that would typically result in probation or short jail terms, only to receive years in a private prison where they were essentially forced into labor. The media coverage was relentless. Naomi Washington's initial expose had opened the floodgates, and now every outlet wanted a piece of the story. Cable news shows ran special segments with titles like Justice for Sale and The Prison Prophet Pipeline. Calloway's face appeared on magazine covers alongside headlines asking, "How many more like him?" For Richard Keller, the fallout was equally devastating. As investigators dug deeper into Brandon Keller's death, they discovered something unexpected. Brandon had been documenting the same safety concerns that Darius had reported. Based on the evidence we've uncovered, FBI Special Agent Thomas Harrington announced in a press conference, Brandon Keller was not killed by Darius Wilson. He was murdered by his business partner James Whitman after Keller discovered their company was deliberately using substandard materials that posed serious safety risks. Whitman, confronted with the evidence, confessed to the murder, admitting he had electrocuted Brandon using the faulty panel, then worked with Richard Keller to frame Darius. Richard had known all along that Darius was innocent. In fact, that knowledge had made him the perfect scapegoat. Brandon was going soft, Whitman told investigators. He was talking about coming clean, fixing the problems, even if it meant delays and extra costs. His father couldn't allow that. The Riverside project was too important to their investors. This revelation added another layer to the scandal. Richard Keller had not only framed an innocent man, but had participated in covering up his own son's murder to protect his business interests. The plea deals began soon after. Lesser officials implicated in the scheme cooperated in exchange for reduced charges, each providing more details about the corrupt network that had operated with impunity for years. Walsh agreed to testify against Calloway and Keller, receiving a 10-year sentence instead of the potential 30 he faced. Reynolds, despite her attempts to claim ignorance, was disbarred and sentenced to 15 years for her role in multiple wrongful prosecutions. For Calloway, there would be no deals. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and prosecutors were determined to make an example of a judge who had so egregiously betrayed his oath. At his arraignment, Calloway appeared a shell of his former self. Gone was the arrogance that had defined him on the bench, replaced by the haunted look of a man facing the end of everything he had built. "How do you plead?" asked Judge Sarah Mitchell, the same judge who had relieved him of his duties. "Not guilty," Calloway replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Outside the courtroom, Elijah Banks watched the proceedings with a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness for what the system had become. Maya stood beside him, her decision to become a whistleblower having cost her job but given her something more valuable, the knowledge that she had helped right a terrible wrong. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we make sure this doesn't just end with Calloway," Elijah replied. "There's an entire system that allowed this to happen, that looked the other way while people's lives were destroyed. That's what needs to change." The investigation into Correct Life facilities revealed horrifying conditions. Inmates were forced to work 12-hour shifts in dangerous manufacturing operations, denied medical care, and subjected to extended solitary confinement if they complained or failed to meet quotas. The company had been cutting corners on everything from food to basic safety measures, all while collecting millions in government funding. It was a modern plantation system, explained a former guard who had become a whistleblower. Most of the inmates were black or Hispanic, most were in for non-violent offenses, and all of them were treated like their lives didn't matter. As evidence of mistreatment mounted, public outrage grew. Protests formed outside Correct Life prisons, demanding the release of inmates who had been sentenced under Calloway's corrupt regime. Families held vigils for loved ones still incarcerated, sharing stories of excessive sentences for minor crimes. The financial ties between Calloway, Keller, and Correct Life became a focal point of the federal investigation. Bank records showed Calloway had received over $12 million over the years from his partnership with the prison company, all carefully hidden through offshore accounts and shell corporations. Richard Keller's empire began to crumble as investors pulled out and projects were suspended pending investigation. The Riverside development, the project that had been the catalyst for framing Darius, was halted entirely after inspectors found numerous safety violations exactly where Darius had reported them. Media coverage of the scandal continued unabated, with Naomi Washington's reporting leading the way. Footage of Calloway mocking Darius in court played repeatedly, alongside images of him being led away in handcuffs, becoming a powerful symbol of justice finally being served. After weeks of revelations, Richard Keller was formally charged as the mastermind behind multiple frame-ups, including the conspiracy to blame Darius for his son's murder. The indictment described a pattern of eliminating obstacles to Keller's development plans through false criminal charges, intimidation, and in Brandon's case, covering up the actual murder. Richard Keller prioritized profit over everything, including justice, safety, and even his own son's life, U.S. Attorney Grace Williams declared at a press conference announcing the charges. This case represents one of the most disturbing abuses of wealth and power this office has ever encountered. When James Whitman's full confession was made public, detailing how he had killed Brandon Keller and then worked with Richard to frame Darius, the last shreds of sympathy for the Keller family evaporated. Brandon had discovered the dangerous shortcuts in their buildings and had planned to address them, essentially supporting what Darius had been reporting all along. This revelation transformed Darius from suspected murderer to vindicated whistleblower in the public's perception. He began receiving calls from news outlets seeking interviews, from attorneys offering to represent him in civil suits, and from advocacy groups asking him to speak about his experience. Throughout it all, Darius remained focused on rebuilding his life with Zora. He returned to their modest home, grateful to find that neighbors had maintained the property during his absence. Community members stopped by with food, offers of help, and apologies for having doubted his innocence. "I don't blame people for believing what they were told," Darius told Zora one evening as they sat on their front porch. "The system is designed to make you trust it, to believe that justice is being served. The problem isn't people who were fooled, it's the ones who did the fooling." As the weeks passed and the investigation continued, Darius received a call that would change the direction of his life. It was from Elijah Banks. "Mr. Wilson," Elijah said, "I'm putting together a team to review all of Calloway's previous cases. We believe dozens of people may have been wrongfully convicted. Your perspective would be invaluable if you're willing to help." Darius didn't hesitate. "I'll be there." 3 months after Darius Wilson walked free, he stood on the front step of the modest home he shared with Zora, taking in the early morning quiet. The nightmare of his wrongful prosecution seemed distant now, though he knew the experience had changed him forever. The reunion with Zora had been everything he'd dreamed of during those dark days in custody. Their home, maintained by neighbors who had believed in his innocence, welcomed them back with a sense of normalcy that had seemed impossible just months earlier. "Dad?" Zora called from inside. "Aunt Tanya's here." Darius smiled as his sister's car pulled into the driveway. Tanya had been Zora's rock during the ordeal, and the bond between them had grown stronger through the shared experience. "You ready for this?" Tanya asked as she approached, coffee in hand. "As ready as I'll ever be," Darius replied. Today marked the beginning of his new role with the Judicial Review Commission, established to examine all of Calloway's previous rulings. With Elijah Banks appointed as senior advisor, the commission had been given unprecedented authority to recommend case reversals where evidence of bias or corruption was found. Later that morning, Darius sat in a conference room with Elijah, Maya, and a team of attorneys and investigators, all committed to finding justice for Calloway's victims. "The truth about Brandon Keller has finally come to light," Elijah announced, distributing files to the team. Further investigation has revealed he had begun his own documentation of the safety violations Darius reported. According to James Whitman's expanded testimony, Brandon was preparing to correct these issues, even planning to publicly acknowledge the concerns Darius had raised. "So he might have become an ally," Darius mused. "It appears so," Elijah confirmed, "which makes his murder and your framing even more tragic. Brandon might have been turning away from his father's corrupt practices." The commission's work was challenging but vital. They reviewed hundreds of cases, identifying patterns where defendants from minority communities received particularly harsh sentences, especially when their cases intersected with Keller business interests. Maya, who had leveraged her insider knowledge of the court's operations to join a civil rights law firm, worked closely with the commission. Her experience as Calloway's clerk provided crucial insights into how he had manipulated cases. In retrospect, the signs were everywhere, she told Darius during a late working session. The way certain files were marked, how evidence was categorized, which witnesses were deemed credible. It was a completely biased system designed to appear impartial. "Most people never see behind the curtain," Darius replied. "I certainly didn't, until I was caught in it." The commission's most significant early victory came with the formation of a special task force to investigate correct life facilities. The private prison company's practices had been exposed as little more than legalized slavery, with inmates forced to work in dangerous conditions for pennies per hour. One rainy Tuesday, Darius, Elijah, and Naomi Washington visited Correct Life's main facility, where they interviewed inmates who had been sentenced in Calloway's court. Their stories were hauntingly similar. Minor offenses resulting in lengthy sentences, all served in a prison where they became cheap labor for corporate profits. "I got 5 years for shoplifting," one man told them, his eyes hollow from the experience. "First offense, Judge Calloway said he needed to make an example of me." 7 years for possession, another reported. "White guy in the same court, same day, same charge, got probation." Each testimony strengthened the case against the corrupt system, providing further evidence for the dozens of appeals now moving through the courts. Meanwhile, Calloway's legal troubles mounted. After weeks of pretrial hearings and failed attempts to suppress evidence, he faced a moment of truth that had been decades in the making. The courtroom was packed for Calloway's sentencing. After a trial that lasted 3 weeks, he had been convicted on multiple counts of bribery, corruption, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. Now he stood before Judge William Anderson, a respected federal judge brought in specifically to handle the high-profile case. "Henry Calloway," Judge Anderson began, his voice grave, "you have been found guilty of crimes that strike at the very heart of our justice system. As a judge, you were entrusted with upholding the law impartially and protecting the rights of all who appeared before you. Instead, you sold justice to the highest bidder and persecuted the innocent for personal gain." Calloway stood silently, his once imposing presence diminished by disgrace. "The damage you have done cannot be easily measured," Anderson continued. "Lives have been destroyed, families torn apart, and public trust in our institutions severely damaged. Your actions represent the most profound betrayal of judicial ethics I have encountered in my 30 years on the bench." The sentence came as no surprise to those who had followed the case closely. 30 years in federal prison, ironically, the average sentence Calloway had given to defendants who were later found to have been wrongfully convicted. "Your request for protective custody is denied," Judge Anderson added. "You will serve your sentence in the general population of a federal prison, experiencing the same conditions as those you so callously condemned." As Calloway was led away, Darius watched from the gallery, feeling not triumph but a somber satisfaction. That justice, however delayed, had finally been served. Richard Keller's fate was equally severe. Convicted of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory to murder, he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The man who had once been among the city's most powerful figures would spend the rest of his days behind bars, his empire dismantled, his legacy one of corruption and cruelty. In the months that followed, the Riverside neighborhood, which had been slated for demolition under Keller's development plan, underwent a transformation of a different kind. Community organizations, working with city officials and ethical developers, began a restoration project designed to improve infrastructure while preserving the area's historical and cultural significance. To Darius's surprise, he was offered the position of lead electrician on the project, his expertise now valued rather than suppressed. The same safety concerns he had raised about Keller's plans became the foundation for ensuring the revitalized neighborhood would be both beautiful and safe. "It's like coming full circle," he told Zora as they walked through the neighborhood, watching crews repair historic buildings rather than demolish them. "What almost destroyed us is now helping rebuild something better." The judicial reforms triggered by the scandal were sweeping. New oversight committees were established to monitor judges' financial interests and connections. Jury selection processes were revised to prevent manipulation, and independent reviews of sentencing patterns became mandatory to identify potential bias. Private prisons faced unprecedented scrutiny, with Correct Life facilities ultimately shut down after federal investigations revealed human rights violations throughout their operations. The inmates were transferred to state facilities, with those convicted in Callaway's court given priority for case reviews. Maya's career in civil rights law flourished as she used her unique perspective to advocate for transparency in the justice system. Her first-hand knowledge of how corruption could hide in plain sight made her a powerful voice for reform. 1 year after his exoneration, Darius stood before a community gathering in the revitalized Riverside neighborhood. The restored community center was filled with residents, activists, and many who had been directly affected by the Callaway-Keller corruption. "A year ago, I was facing a lifetime in prison for a crime I didn't commit," he began, his voice steady. "Today, I'm standing here as proof that the truth, no matter how buried or suppressed, can eventually come to light." The audience applauded, many nodding in agreement. But my story is just one of hundreds. There are still people serving sentences, handed down by a corrupt judge, still families suffering the consequences of injustice. Our work isn't done until every one of those cases has been reviewed and every wrong has been made right. Darius had established a support network for families of the wrongfully convicted, connecting them with legal resources and providing the emotional support that only someone who had lived through the experience could offer. The organization had already helped secure the release of 17 people convicted in Callaway's court. "Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty," Darius continued. "It's about protecting the innocent. It's about creating a system that works for everyone, not just those with money and power, and that's a responsibility we all share." As he spoke, the cameras captured his words for the evening news. In a prison cell hundreds of miles away, Henry Callaway watched the broadcast on a small communal television, surrounded by the very population he had once sentenced with such callous disregard. For the first time, perhaps, Callaway truly understood the human cost of what he had done, not as abstract statistics or case numbers, but as real people with lives and families and dreams that his corruption had nearly destroyed. Darius concluded his speech with words that would be quoted in the ongoing national conversation about justice reform. "The system failed me, but people didn't. It was individuals, standing up for truth, risking everything for what's right, who made the difference. And that gives me hope, because systems can be changed when enough good people demand better." As he stepped down from the podium to embrace Zora, who had watched proudly from the front row, Darius Wilson had completed his journey from victim to advocate. The injustice he had faced had not broken him, but transformed him into a powerful voice for those still fighting to be heard. The work would continue. There were still cases to review, reforms to implement, and hearts and minds to change. But, on this day, in this moment, justice and redemption had prevailed over corruption and power. And for Darius Wilson, and all those who had stood with him, That was enough to celebrate today and to provide hope for tomorrow. How many innocents still sit behind bars while their judges walk free? How many voices remain silenced by a system built to protect power, not people? Darius Wilson's story is one of thousands. The only difference is that his was told. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe for more tales of injustice exposed and wrongs made right.